Nomination of Julie Su to be the Secretary of the United States Department of Labor, and I welcome her this morning. And let me get directly to the point. I strongly support Ms. Su's nomination. She has been an excellent Deputy Secretary of Labor for the last 2 years, and I believe she will make an excellent Secretary of Labor into the future. And I hope very much that she will be confirmed by the Senate, and we need her in her job as soon as possible. And let us be honest as we gather this morning, the debate over Ms. Su really has nothing to do with her qualifications. No one can tell us with a straight face that Ms. Su is unqualified for this position. In fact, she is extremely well qualified. This debate really has everything to do with the fact that Julie Su is a champion of the working class of this country who will stand up against the forces of corporate greed. That's really what this debate is about. And let's be very clear. For the last 50 years, middle class and working class of this country have been struggling. While we have more income and wealth inequality today than we have ever had, over 60% of our people are living paycheck to paycheck, and millions are working for starvation wages. Julie Su should be confirmed as our Secretary of Labor because she has spent her life fighting for those working families, and they need her now. What this nomination is about is really not complicated. Today, as we speak, large multinational corporations are spending millions of dollars on ads, sometimes ugly ads, various parts of this country trying to defeat her nomination. They know what I know, and that is that she is prepared to take on powerful special interests and stand up to the needs of those working people who desperately need defending today. And while many corporate interests, not all, but many oppose her nomination, she is supported by every major labor organization in this country, representing over 20 million workers, including the AFL-CIO, the United Mine Workers of America, the Teamsters, and the SEIU. All strongly support Ms. Su's confirmation. Let us be clear. We need a labor secretary who understands that we must raise the minimum wage to a living wage, something that this committee intends to do. We need a labor secretary who will work each and every day to make it easier, not harder, for workers to exercise their constitutional right to join unions and collectively bargain for better wages, benefits, and working conditions. We need a labor secretary who understands that we must end the international embarrassment of the United States being the only major country on earth that does not guarantee paid family and medical leave or paid sick days, something that this committee will also address. This is America, and when your child or your spouse gets sick, you should not be fired from your job because you're taking care of them. Julie Su understands that. We need a labor secretary who understands that it is unacceptable that women in this country are earning just 84 cents on the dollar compared to men, and that we need equal pay for equal work, something this committee will also address. We need a labor secretary who believes that young people in this country should have access to apprenticeship programs which give them the skills they need to get good-paying jobs rebuilding America, something that this committee will also address. We need a labor secretary who understands that employees in America who are working 50 or 60 hours a week should not continue to be cheated out of the overtime pay that they have earned and are entitled to. We need a labor secretary who will strongly enforce the child labor laws that are on the books and oppose the exploitation of underage workers by unscrupulous employers. We need a labor secretary who understands that it is unacceptable that half of older Americans have no retirement savings and that we need to expand, not cut pensions in our country. I strongly believe that Julie Su will be that labor secretary. As I think we all know, 2 years ago, the Senate voted to confirm Julie Su's nomination to be the Deputy Secretary of Labor by a vote of 50 to 47. Every Democrat in the Senate voted for her nomination. Every Republican in the Senate voted against her nomination. The only thing that has changed since that vote is that Julie Su has done an outstanding job as Deputy Secretary of Labor. Working with former Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, who strongly supports her confirmation, Ms. Su has worked to successfully expand apprenticeships to more than 30,000 Americans so that they can get the high-quality manufacturing and construction jobs that are desperately needed to rebuild this country. Now, I understand that some of my Republican colleagues have expressed concerns about the 11% unemployment insurance fraud rate that occurred in California during the height of the pandemic when Julie Su was California's Secretary of Labor. But here is what my colleagues conveniently ignore. During that same period, the unemployment insurance fraud rate was 15.4% in Tennessee, 15.3% in Arizona, 14.3% in South Carolina, and over 14% in Massachusetts. All of those states had Republican governors and Republican labor secretaries, and all of those states experienced higher unemployment insurance fraud rates than California. I should also add that the unemployment insurance fraud rate was 27% in Kansas, 23% in Rhode Island, 18% in Nevada, 16% in New York. I don't know what it was in Vermont, but it was pretty high in Vermont as well. All substantially higher than California. The reality is that virtually every state in America faced major challenges with respect to fraud in the unemployment insurance program. Why was that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. In the midst of a horrific pandemic, when President Trump was in office and Mitch McConnell led the Senate, when millions of Americans were rapidly losing their jobs, and we all remember those terrible days through no fault of their own, Republicans and Democrats came together and passed the CARES Act by a vote of 96-0. Every member who was in the Senate at that time voted for it, who's here today. Republicans and Democrats made a conscious decision that the top priority in 2020 was to get unemployment benefits out as quickly as possible to millions of Americans who desperately needed it, and to relax regulations because we were dealing with an unprecedented economic and public health emergency. And that's precisely what we did in the CARES Act that Donald Trump signed into law. The truth is that the Trump administration failed to provide adequate guidance and resources to states on how to administer these emergency unemployment benefits, and as a result, fraud went up all across the country. That was not something that Julie Su did. That is what every Republican and every Democrat who was present at the time voted for in the Senate. That is what Donald Trump signed into law, and that is what the Republican Department of Labor administered. Further, and importantly, under Ms. Su's leadership, California was the first state to implement safeguards to combat fraud in the Emergency Unemployment Assistance Program. These safeguards were later promoted by the Trump administration, appropriately so, and implemented nationwide. Those are the facts, and they are not in dispute. Julie Su has the experience, she has the qualifications, she has the passion, and she has the ability to be an outstanding Secretary of Labor. I am proud to support her nomination, and I am pleased to welcome her to our committee this morning. Senator Cassidy, you are now recognized for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Sanders. I disagree, Ms. Su, nice to see you. I can actually disagree with Senator Sanders. And as much as I think of Ms. Su, as highly as I think of Ms. Su, and as pleasantly as I regard you, I will disagree with Senator Sanders and can say with a straight face that I do not think that you should be Secretary of Labor. The committee's priority should be, and put differently, and to use Senator Sanders' words, we need a labor secretary who is fair and unbiased when enforcing the nation's labor laws, who should be a leader who is responsible, experienced, and skilled, not an activist, with a demonstrated record of competence as an administrator and a demonstrated record of successfully concluding labor negotiations. But there are, as Senator Sanders points out, serious concerns about Ms. Su's record. As Secretary of California Labor and Workforce Development Agency, Ms. Sue was the chief enforcer of AB 5, controversial law that dismantled the gig economy such as Uber, DoorDash, Lyft, and removed the flexibility of these individuals to work as an independent contractor. Senator Sanders suggested all workers would be united in supporting this nomination. Those independent contractors opposed AB 5. Ms. Sue expressed herself as merely being an enforcer of a law passed down by others, but I've spoken to people in California that said Ms. Sue was quite the cheerleader for the law. Now, to be clear, independent contractors, freelancers, make their own hours and choose the type of work they wish to do. They're shielded from forced or coerced unionization that would strip that flexibility away. This has made eliminating freelancing a top priority for large labor unions, those that are endorsing this nomination, who want more workers paying forced union dues. It's important to know, even in California, AB 5 is unpopular. The governor and state legislature had to pass over 100 exemptions after it was implemented. In fact, the statutory exemptions are longer than the text of AB 5 itself. 59% of Californians voted to further erode the law, which naturally labor unions challenged in court. In 2019, Ms. Sue described employers who opposed California's overreaching law as not understanding the economy that, quote, her quote, we want in California. As acting and Deputy Secretary of Labor, Ms. Sue is overseeing the Biden's administration push to eliminate independent contracting via federal executive rulemaking to the detriment of workers. If finalized, the new regulation would strip 21 million individuals of their ability to be independent contractors, enjoying the flexibility this provides. A law rejected in California is not a policy that should be spread across the nation. I also wish to hear Ms. Sue's position on the Department of Labor's effort to uproot the franchise model. She had said privately that she will not pursue this, but the franchise model employs over 8 million Americans. She has made public comments in support of a new joint employer rule, which would impact the almost 800,000 franchises operating in our communities. Saddling franchisors with liability for thousands of franchise owners that operate as small businesses would be a sure way to destroy the system of franchising, a model which has empowered underrepresented groups in the business community, such as women and people of color, giving them the opportunity to live the American dream, becoming successful small business owners, creating jobs, and lifting other workers out of poverty. No one is surprised that the joint employer rule is a major priority for large labor unions. It's easier to pressure one company to unionize to increase union dues than to pressure thousands of independent businesses. President Biden promises to have the most pro-union administration in history. At her nomination announcement, Ms. Sue responded saying, quote, "Sign me up for that. I want to help." The priority should not be whatever it makes it easier to forcibly and coercively unionize workers while undermining the business model that employs them. Now, as a Republican, I don't expect to agree with the political positions of a Biden nominee, but we should expect that the heads of our federal government are not driven by activism to carry out an agenda for a favored political group. We need leaders who will responsibly carry out the duties of the office and give all comers a fair shake. It is also the responsibility of the Secretary to be a good administrator. As Secretary of the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency, as Senator Sanders points out, Ms. Sue oversaw the Employment Development Department, the EDD, the state's unemployment program. This program lost over $30 billion in fraud by waiving fact-checking requirements recommended by Department of Labor guidance. The California State Auditor reported, quote, "Despite repeated warnings, EDD did not bolster its fraud detection efforts until months into the pandemic, and it suspended a critical safeguard." Under Ms. Sue, fraud in California was rampant. Rapper Nuke Bizzle was arrested, pled guilty, and ordered to pay $705,000 in restitution after posting a music video bragging about how easy it was to defraud the EDD program. The lyrics include, quote, I done got rich off of EDD. Ain't hit no more licks 'cause of EDD. Just last night I was selling peas, and I just woke up to 300 G's. For the record, my interpretation is 300 G's is $300,000, but he was ordered to pay over 700 G's back in restitution. The rapper was not held accountable because of Ms. Sue's oversight, but because he publicly admitted to his crime on a rap video. I ask unanimous consent to insert a transcript of Nuke Bizzle's music video entitled EDD into the record.
You're into rap, we're going to put it into the record.
This mismanagement does not inspire confidence that Ms. Sue can run a multi-billion-dollar organization. Now, by the way, former Labor Secretary Marty Walsh developed trust with the business community as well as labor unions. Setting his politics aside, Marty Walsh had significant experience in negotiations and managing organizations. That experience is important. But now with 150 labor contracts expiring this year, the potential of replacing him with someone who has a history of bias and no direct experience handling labor disputes should be concerning to all. I look forward to hearing from Ms. Sue as she addresses these concerns of the committee. With that, I yield.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. I'd now like to welcome our nominee. Julie Sue is currently the acting secretary for the Department of Labor, and for the past 2 years has served as the deputy secretary to Secretary Marty Walsh. I thank her for being here with us today, and now I turn it over to Senator Padilla from California to introduce her.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member Cassidy for allowing me to introduce Acting Secretary of Labor, Julie Sue. Julie is a proud Californian, and as you will continue to hear, a champion for workers everywhere. Julie is indeed was a tireless advocate for workers in California for years, so much so that 2 months after I joined the Senate in early 2021, I had the honor of introducing her to this very committee when President Biden nominated her to serve as Deputy Secretary of Labor. And in the time since her first confirmation, she's proven to be a highly effective Deputy Secretary of Labor, and now Acting Secretary, helping this administration add more than 12.5 million jobs to the American economy. That's since President Biden's first day in office. That's more job gains than any previous president in a 4-year term. And that's no exaggeration. And during that time, Julie's also been a relentless defender of the rights and dignity of workers. Job creation and labor protection are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, they go hand in hand in a strong, responsible economy. But you see, her service and her track record comes as no surprise once you understand where she's come from. She's a proud daughter of immigrants and a native of California, and she knows personally the sacrifices that many working families face just to make ends meet. Her parents worked hard for decades in minimum wage jobs before establishing and growing their own small business. So they've seen both sides of a paycheck. They instilled in Julie a strong work ethic that led her to take on tough fights for workers as a labor lawyer, as labor secretary for the state of California, and as deputy secretary for the U.S. Department of Labor. During her time as Secretary of Labor in California, she launched the first Wage Theft is a Crime campaign so that both employers, yes, employers as well as low-wage workers, better understood their rights and responsibilities. And as the Secretary of the California Labor and Workforce Development Agency for the then 5th largest economy in the world, now the 4th largest economy in the world, she managed 7 major departments, boards, and panels to promote quality jobs, provide workforce training, and strengthen the state's economy. Did I mention California is now the 4th largest economy in the world? On a personal note, it was a privilege for me to work alongside Julie when she led the campaign in California to help low-wage workers understand their rights and feel protected when speaking up about labor abuses. That's critically important and timely. Colleagues, I know that many of you have expressed concern about recent reports about child labor violations in America, particularly migrant children being exploited in the workplace. Several senators, including many Republican senators, just the other day expressed their dismay in his GAC, calling on the federal government to do its part on cracking down on these labor violations and holding people accountable. If we're genuine and sincere about our dismay about the reported child labor violations, then you need to agree that we need Julie Su confirmed as soon as possible. Her experience and qualifications are unmatched, and I'm confident that her service will fundamentally strengthen the American workforce in the years ahead. Confirming Acting Secretary Su to serve as the chief defender of workers and workers' rights in the biggest economy in the world will send a strong and important message that in America, workers are valued, workers come first. And as former Secretary Walsh put it, Julie is a lifelong champion of America's workers. And if confirmed as the first Asian American to serve as Secretary in President Biden's cabinet, millions of Americans will see themselves represented in the highest levels of our government and will take pride in her story as a daughter of working-class immigrants. So yes, Julie is exactly the pioneering labor champion that workers deserve to lead the Department of Labor now. And I'm thankful that President Biden has chosen to nominate her for this position. Colleagues, I urge you to join me in supporting her nomination. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Ms. Su, the floor is yours. Thanks for being with us.
Chairman Sanders, Ranking Member Cassidy, and members of the committee. I am honored to appear before you today. I have enjoyed our discussions prior to this hearing about the Department of Labor and its role in meeting the critical challenges of our time. I am grateful to have my daughter, Lee May, a college senior who is graduating from Yale next month, with me today. As a political science major, she, like I, are aware of how amazing it is for her to be able to be here, not just for me, but to see democracy in action up close. My other daughter, An Ling, is in her sophomore year at Amherst College, where she is on the basketball team, and she is taking an economics midterm today. So we thought that it was better for her to stay on campus. And my parents, sister, and brother-in-law are all up early and watching from California. I want to start by thanking President Biden for this incredible opportunity and Senator Padilla for the very warm introduction. As Deputy Secretary of Labor, I have worked hand in hand with Secretary Marty Walsh to deliver on the President's promise of an economy built from the bottom up and the middle out. And the results speak for themselves. The US economy has added a record 12.6 million jobs. The lowest unemployment rate, it's been less than 4% for more than a year, which is close to the lowest it's been in 50 years. All while labor force participation by prime age workers has returned to pre-pandemic levels. When he announced my nomination for US Secretary of Labor, the President called me the American Dream. My parents believed in it, I benefited from it, and I want to do my part to make sure it is a reality for workers across the nation. The dream for my family began with my mom's 30-day voyage on a cargo ship to the United States because she couldn't afford a passenger ticket. Both of my parents came to America for opportunity, and they found it. In Provo, Utah, where they studied, in Madison, Wisconsin, where my sister and I were born, and then in Southern California, where they settled and built a life. To get through school, my parents worked minimum wage jobs. When I was 6 years old, my mom got a job for Los Angeles County as an office clerk. And this job gave our family two crucial things: financial security and health insurance. It also afforded my mother a pension, which guarantees my mother and father's financial security into their old age. This level of economic security was impossible for them to imagine as they worked long hours and came home every night with the same first question from my sister and me: did you finish your homework yet? But that is the transformative power of a good union job, something I can speak to personally. While I was growing up, my family also saw opportunity and their shot at the middle class in the form of small business. They owned a dry cleaning and laundromat business and then a franchise pizza restaurant. For years, my dad would work his day job and then head right to the pizza shop, returning home after 10 p.m., often with a pizza for my sister and me to take to lunch the next day. I know small business owners are the engines of our economy because I have watched it and I saw it every day. I also grew up translating for my parents, a common experience in immigrant families. After college, I went to law school and became the first lawyer in my family. My experience as a translator at home shaped my commitment to making the law understandable and meaningful to individuals and communities too often left out of our economy. Immediately after law school, I spent nearly 2 decades representing workers. What I learned is that too many people still work full-time, year-round, and live in poverty. Too many are denied a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. At the same time, I learned that working people, when given a chance to organize, to be heard, not only make things better for themselves, but help to bring the American dream within reach to those around them. If confirmed, I will bring these lessons and experiences to my role as we continue to rebuild the economy. I will work to ensure that hard work pays off for workers and for small businesses, just like it did for my family. Prior to coming to the Department of Labor, I served the people of California for a decade. I saw firsthand that government has a meaningful role to play in providing support to the overwhelming majority of employers who play by the rules. One of these roles is investments in workforce programs to provide training to meet employers' need for skilled workers and to give more workers access to quality jobs. Over the last 2 years, Secretary Walsh and I worked side by side to expand apprenticeships in in-demand industries and training opportunities for jobs like building roads and bridges, manufacturing semiconductors, building wind turbines, solar panels, and so much more. Many of these jobs do not require a 4-year degree. We created a national youth employment work strategy and expanded investments in rural communities, tribal communities, and mental health, along with other initiatives to ensure that our nation's workers are ready to meet the needs of employers in jobs across America. I have been a leader dedicated to finding and expanding the vast areas of common ground between employers and employees. While my job as Deputy Secretary meant that my primary focus was on the internal operations at the department, Secretary Walsh's leadership style was to involve me as a true partner. I was with him for the 20-hour negotiation between rail employers and rail unions that took place in our office. And I've traveled from New Orleans to Detroit, from Indianapolis to Nashville, from San Juan to Houston, where I've seen firsthand the strength and creativity of America's workers and small businesses. Secretary Walsh and I also expanded our compliance assistance for employers and employees, providing real-time information through MSHA's new Minor Safety and Health app to keep minors safe, helping employers work with employees with disabilities to put job accommodations in place, and supporting employers to adopt workplace health and safety programs, including how to find and fix hazards. I believe that the Department of Labor should make it as easy as possible for employers to keep workers safe on the job. If confirmed, you can count on me to listen to employers' views about how best to do that. So all of this brings me to today. President Biden asked me to finish the job that Secretary Walsh and I started. If confirmed as Secretary of Labor, I would work to preserve and expand the American dream for all Americans. And I look forward to working with all of you in partnership on this shared endeavor. I look forward to your questions.
Sue, thank you very much. And as the son of an immigrant who came to this country without a nickel in his pocket, I very much appreciate what you have said. It's the story of millions of Americans. I want you to continue your opening statement in terms of giving us your sense of what your major accomplishments have been, what you're proud of in terms of the work you did in California, what you have done in the last several years here in the Department of Labor, and maybe more importantly, what your vision is. What do you want to do? What are the problems that you see out there, and what do you want to accomplish as our Secretary of Labor?
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Sanders. Thank you also for the meeting that we had. I know that we talked about how we need a Secretary of Labor who is going to deliver in this moment, and I really enjoyed our conversation. And thank you for that question. You've already laid out so clearly what a historic economic recovery this has been. The president says it himself all the time, right? This is what it looks like to build an economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And I've been a part of the administration for the last 2 years. I've been very proud to see what good, thoughtful policy and implementation look like. Because of that work, in partnership with Congress, our economy continues to defy expectations. 12.6 million jobs represents a mom getting back to work after the disruption of COVID. It represents a veteran coming back from military service and getting a seamless transition into civilian life. One woman I met is now laying pipes 30 feet underground and doing a job that she never imagined for herself. And when she comes home at the end of the day, her hands are dirty, but she says her children are really proud of her. I think that 12.6 million jobs is 12.6 million stories like that.
Let me ask you this. You touched on it in your remarks, and it's something this committee, I hope, will be able to deal with in a bipartisan way. You mentioned that there are, in so many words, there are millions of young people who do not necessarily want to go to college, who are prepared to get their hands dirty, go out, earn good wages, doing some of the important work that needs to be done to rebuild America. Talk a little bit about your vision of strong apprenticeship programs for our country.
So there's so much we can do there. Thank you so much, Chairman Sanders. And we've been doing it over the last 2 years at the Department of Labor. We have dramatically expanded apprenticeships across the country. We have, just in the last 2 years, over 4,600 new apprenticeship programs representing 11,000 or so employers. These are opportunities to make sure not only that job seekers, and in particular young people, get the high-quality skills training that they need, but that employers who are looking for skilled workers to do the many things that we are doing right now, right? Rebuilding roads and bridges and ensuring broad internet accessibility to communities all across the country, making sure that every family that turns on the faucet gets clean drinking water out of it, building coast-to-coast electric vehicle charging stations. All of this work needs workers. And employers have been saying that, what are we going to do to make sure that we have the workers that we need? And apprenticeship programs are a big part of that answer. Our overall workforce development system is a big part of that answer. And my team has heard me say this at the Department of Labor many, many times. We can build physical roads and bridges. We also have to build the roads and bridges that connect people to the jobs they need.
So
that's what the system
What
will
I'm
do.
hearing from you as Secretary of Labor, you're prepared to work with this committee to greatly expand apprenticeship programs in this country. Child labor is an issue, as Senator Padilla mentioned a moment ago, of great concern. You have some experience in that issue. Tell us what you would like to accomplish to make sure that kids in this country are not exploited by unscrupulous employers.
Thank you very much for that question, too, Chairman Sanders. As we have seen, there's been increased attention to the truly horrific examples of child labor that we've seen of late. To be clear, we're not talking about a young person who's getting their first summer job at the local retail store working the cash register, where they're learning how to show up on time and work with customers. In the most recent case that the Department of Labor found, it was over 100 children as young as 13 working in meat packing facilities on the night shift doing cleaning work. I think we can all agree that that is exploitative child labor that we do not want to see, and the Department of Labor is not only continuing to enforce the law, we're also leading an interagency task force across the federal government to make sure that we are exchanging information as needed and bringing all of our resources to bear, and that's another thing I would look forward to working with this committee and Congress on if asked.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Cassidy.
Thank you, Ms. Sue. Let me just first express admiration for your incredible personal story. And all of us are one or two generations from a story like that, and yours is more immediate, so let me just first express that. Speaking about policy issues, though, AB 5, controversial, in many quarters in California, unpopular. You supported and helped implement. In 2019, you described that those who do not want to comply with the overreaching law as not understanding the economy that, quote, we want in California. And the we want is kind of a royal we. And it's important to note that the legislature had to go back and pass almost 100 exemptions. So I say that because I think one thing that concerns us, would you commit to not trying to force an AB 5 type regulation upon the rest of the country, that which was done in California?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The short answer to your question is yes. The context to your question is that the ABC test in California was first adopted by a unanimous California Supreme Court decision that was written by a Republican-appointed Chief Justice.
Now, isn't it fair to say that this AB 5 greatly expanded that decision and covered workers that were not necessarily covered by that decision but went far beyond?
Well, following that decision, the California legislature did pass AB 5 that codified the test. To be extremely clear, I was not part of the legislature. I have never been a legislator. I have tremendous respect for what you all do. I have not done that job. And so the ABC test was codified in California. It's not the only state that has it. But when the Department of Labor issued our rule on independent contractor versus employee classification, we explicitly did not include the ABC test in our rule. So that is why I answer yes to your question. Only Congress can adopt the ABC test. I cannot, I
Now,
will
there are
not.
other
I will
things that
enforce-
could be done through a rule that gets at the same point, even if it does not include the ABC. So is that an equal kind of commitment to not attempt to do through rule that which may be absent ABC but otherwise has the same sort of effect?
I will commit with absolute certainty and commitment that I will always have full faith and fidelity to federal law.
Now,
The laws that
that's
you
different,
pass-
because I can promise you, I've learned, give me a smart attorney, and they can find all sorts of interpretations of federal law. Up is up and down is down, but no, sometimes up is down. Let me move on, though, just because I've got limited time. When we met, you said you would not pursue changes to the joint employer regulations if confirmed. We know this is a priority for labor unions. Could you again and for the record give assurances that you will not pursue changes to the joint employer rule as Secretary of Labor?
So, Senator, I know you mentioned the concern about franchisees and franchisors, and I enjoyed our conversation. I mentioned that my family, my parents
Yes.
had a franchisee business. The reason my sister and I were able to go to college.
I
is
got
because of
limited
that
time.
business.
If you-
Okay, so I understand the importance of the model. There's not a joint employer rule on our regulatory agenda. It was not on our agenda that came out last year. We have
And is
another
that
one
to
coming-
say it would not become on the agenda at a later point?
It will not be on our agenda that comes out in June. Correct, Senator.
Next, Ms. Sue, thank you. There's about 150 labor contracts coming up representing 1.6 million workers expiring this year. And one of the concerns about your nomination is that you lack direct experience negotiating and handling labor disputes. And so can you point to any experience negotiating successful outcomes from labor disputes?
Thank you very much, Senator, for that. So I did work very closely with then Secretary Marty Walsh on the negotiations that concluded on our part in September that involved the rail unions and the rail
Now, it's fair to
employers.
say that it actually took Congress and the President to step in and conclude those negotiations. Those were not successful. Fair?
When we concluded our 20-hour negotiation, a tentative agreement was reached that averted what everyone was then saying would have been a national disaster. It is true that there were other parts of the process, as there always are in collective bargaining negotiations at the table. The other thing, to your question, Senator, is that one of the other big issues that's looming is what's happening at the West Coast ports, the ports of LA and Long Beach. in my hometown involving parties and people that I have known for some time, and I have been actively engaged in that conversation as well.
Now, it's
I-
fair to say, though, that those seem to be breaking down. There was a press release in February with optimism, but subsequently there's been other reports not quite so optimistic. So it'd be a stretch to say it's a successful process, correct?
They're not concluded yet, Senator. That is true. My role, if confirmed, would be to, when asked, help make sure that the parties stay at the table, that they are able to grapple with some of the hard issues that they face, and that if asked to come assist, I would do so. I would not give up on those negotiations at this time, Senator.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to enter articles in a letter concerning the ongoing disruptions of the West Coast ports to President Biden from over 300 retailers, urging him to step in and negotiate between the union and management to prevent disruption to the supply chain of American consumers.
Without objection.
With that, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murray.
Acting Secretary Sue, it is great to see you here today. Thank you so much. You've just been a reliable and a fair partner since your confirmation. I really look forward to continuing to work with you on implementing bipartisan priorities that members of this committee on both sides of the aisle passed in just last Congress, like the Secure 2.0 and mental health parity and the PUMP Act, which helps make sure working moms have the simple right to a break and a place to pump at work. So thank you for the work you've done. Let me ask you, as a HELP committee chair, I led a group of senators commenting on the department's proposed rule regarding employee classification. And I've been extremely frustrated regarding all the hand-wringing from some of my colleagues who are misrepresenting this issue. DOL explicitly states in the proposed rule that the Fair Labor Standards Act does not have an ABC test like the test in California. DOL has been very clear. It does not have the authority, as you just stated, to implement an ABC test. That is something that only Congress can do. And everyone out there fear-mongering about an ABC test knows this. In fact, several of them have put out statements acknowledging that after the proposed rule was issued in the fall, on October 11th of last year, Lyft stated this about the independent contractor rule, and I quote, "Importantly, this rule, number one, does not reclassify Lyft drivers as employees, and two, does not enforce Lyft to change our business model. This approach previously applied to Lyft and app-based companies and did not result in reclassification of drivers." On December 14th of last year, the International Franchise Association submitted a statement saying, and I quote, "IFA applauds the proposal for its express recognition that the ABC test does not apply to the Fair Labor Standards Act, appropriately clarifying that the franchise relationship falls outside of its coverage." And Chairman Sanders, I'd like unanimous consent to introduce both the statement from Lyft and the statement from the International Franchise Association that I have here with me into the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Acting Secretary Sue, do you agree with those statements that I just read from Lyft and from the IFA?
Thank you very much, Senator Murray. Lyft knows their business model. I would definitely confirm your point and what I said to the ranking member, that our rule does not include the ABC test. It cannot include the ABC test because only Congress can adopt that test. And our rule is meant to be in full compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act and decades of federal law on the issue.
And is it true that DOL has already stated it does not have the authority under the FLSA to implement an ABC test absent an act of Congress?
That is correct, Senator.
Good. I think that's pretty straightforward, and I hope that clears it up for all of our colleagues who are here. Let me turn to something else. At the end of last year, I was able to work with the bipartisan and bicameral leadership of the three other pension committees to pass a huge bipartisan retirement package in Secure 2.0. DOL is going to oversee the implementation of a considerable number of the provisions, like establishing new emergency savings accounts, which I believe will help expand coverage, creating a retirement savings lost and found to make sure that workers have access to the money they saved at past employers, and many other priorities. If confirmed, will you commit to working with me and all of my colleagues across the aisle to ensure that the provisions of Secure 2.0 are implemented correctly and in a timely manner?
I absolutely will, Senator, and I so hastily answered the first question that I didn't also first say thank you for your leadership as chair of this committee when I came through as deputy secretary. And also you mentioned the Pump Act. And as a mother who breastfed both of my children and had to pump at work, I wanted to thank you for that too. But yes, as to Secure 2.0, of course, we are going to implement it and look forward to working with you on it. The law does require the department to establish a lost and found program, as you mentioned, to make sure that people, Americans who have saved their entire lives for retirement, are able to access those benefits when they retire. Sometimes people change jobs and they lose track, or maybe they forget, and that's why a program like that is so important. The Department of Labor, actually, under our Employee Benefit Security Administration, or EBSA, launched a similar program in 2017 that was really more of an individual case-by-case one, and through that work has recovered $6 billion of retiree benefits for retired Americans. And so Secure 2.0 is going to let us do that for all retirees, and we look forward to working with you to make sure that becomes real.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for all of your work as as Deputy Secretary. Look forward to working with you in the new position. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Deputy Secretary Sue. We now know that unaccompanied minor children are being trafficked in illegal labor markets across the country. Your department wrote last year that violations have increased by some 70% since 2018. Was that communicated to the White House prior to this year? Is that something you've communicated to them, that this is a major, major problem?
So thank you very much, Senator, for the question. As we discussed a little bit earlier today, we are seeing really
I have
horrific-
a very specific question in a very limited time. Did you communicate that as a department to the White House prior to this year?
I don't know the answer to that
Okay,
question,
thank
Senator.
you. My second question, which is, during your last 2 years at the department, the public calendar shows that you've had a standing meeting with unions on a regular basis. But until 6 weeks ago, you'd not met with any business associations. Unions on a regular basis, but not with business associations. I guess it's really hard to understand how, when we think about putting two groups together and getting to the compromise and negotiating, how we can have any confidence that you'd be seen as an unbiased, neutral arbiter, but instead would be biased in such a way that businesses associations are not going to be able to trust the Department of Labor to play a meaningful role. But of greater concern to me is your record in California. And this is something I've raised with you before, but the fact that under your lead, unemployment insurance payments in California of some $31 billion went to people who were basically receiving money on a criminal basis, illegally receiving money from the federal government. $31 billion. That's about as much as we provided in military aid to Ukraine. That's almost twice the total budget of the Department of Labor. Under your leadership in California, $31 billion was fraudulently paid out. Now there's a principle in all sorts of enterprises known as the Peter Principle, which is people get promoted to a point where their competence is no longer been established. In this case, your record there is so severely lacking. I don't know how in the world it makes sense for the president to nominate you to take over this department. To work behind Marty Walsh is one thing, and to learn from him, but you haven't had experience negotiating a major deal between unions and management. And your leadership of an enterprise resulted in $31 billion of fraudulent payments. What am I missing?
So, Senator, thank you on both those points. In terms of business leaders, I think that business leaders and industry associations who've worked with me would paint a different story about both my openness and my desire.
But you've got to meet with them for them to do so. If you haven't met with them for the first 2 years until 6 weeks ago, and you met with unions regularly, that sends a pretty clear message to those business leaders.
So 100% that relationships are very important. I believe that I have them, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about them at any time. But as I said in my opening statement, I think anybody who knows my record would say that I am someone who is communicative, transparent, and really sees that there is tremendous areas of common ground between employers who are job creators and employees who do the work.
That's as accurate as it is irrelevant to your competence to be able to lead a negotiation fraught between unions and management. Help me with the $31 billion.
Thank you for that, Senator. So the vast majority, over 95% of the fraud in the unemployment system, not just in California, but across the nation, was in the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, a program that was passed by Congress to meet a very, very urgent need, an unprecedented crisis that was viewed to require an unprecedented solution. That Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program did not have the safeguards that regular unemployment insurance does. It
You
has
set those safeguards. There are guidelines in California you chose to waive to get that money out. $31 billion.
So,
you
Senator-
realize what $31 billion would have meant to the people in Ukraine? Had we been able to double our military support there?
Yes, yes, and that is why fraud, waste, and abuse of any kind is completely unacceptable. That is why in California, as soon as we knew that there was fraud happening, I shut the front door to that fraud. I made changes to the program that would ensure that people couldn't get in the front door. But to be very clear, the state auditor who did many audits never found that my eliminating eligibility requirements resulted in any of the pandemic unemployment assistance fraud that we're talking about.
My time is up. The buck stops at the top. You're the person running UI. You're the one that decided to waive the guardrails. $31 billion. The idea of promoting a person who's had that experience to a position of leadership of the entire Department of Labor makes no sense at all. Thank you.
Respectfully, Senator, if I may, just on the unemployment insurance fraud issue, California's unemployment insurance fraud rate, which was different from the pandemic unemployment assistance, was really about comparable to what it's been before. The high rates that you're talking about were in a program that did not have the safeguards in its design.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Acting Labor Secretary Sue. I want to revisit a couple of the questions you've gotten from colleagues across the aisle because I didn't hear you get an adequate opportunity yet to answer. So my colleagues have suggested that you are inexperienced in negotiating labor contracts. However, as you mentioned, you stood shoulder to shoulder with former Secretary Walsh for those marathon negotiating sessions to get to a deal to avert a national rail strike and economic shutdown. Further, your nomination is supported by both the Teamsters, representing 340,000 UPS workers, for whom the largest private sector collective bargaining agreement expires in July of this year, and the Port of LA, whose 15,000 workers facilitated $200 billion in trade last year. The collective bargaining agreement for these workers expired in July of 2022, and your experience and relationships with the LA Port will be invaluable in ensuring both sides reach a fair agreement and avoid supply chain disruptions. Ms. Sue, isn't it true that you are significantly experienced and qualified to negotiate vital labor agreements?
Thank you so much, Senator. I appreciated our meeting, and I appreciate that question. And yes, I believe that I am.
Thank you. To hear some of my colleagues tell it, you are also writing regulations with no regard to the impact on small businesses. Your track record, not to mention your life story, tells a very different story. Not only are you endorsed by your hometown's Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles, but you have worked with National Chamber and many industry associations throughout your tenure. Can you talk a little bit about some of the initiatives you've had that you've worked on as Deputy Secretary and how you proactively sought out and incorporated the input of the industries involved in those initiatives?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Senator. Over my tenure as Deputy Secretary, again, working very closely with Secretary Marty Walsh, we spend a lot of time talking to employers, individual employers, industry associations, about especially about their workforce needs. How are we going to match the needs that employers have for workers with the desire that workers have for good jobs, for better jobs, and for training programs that will align the two things? And so I sat down in Michigan with both employers and unions about what it's going to look like as we build more electric vehicles, for example. I've sat down with employers and across the country around how we can support them in expanding their apprenticeship programs or creating, not just employer by employer training, but looking at the sector as a whole, right? The needs that we have today require more than just matching between employers and job seekers, but really building capacity in communities to do training on a sector-wide basis. And sector industry leaders representing employers are really key to that, which is why I have met with them and why those who do know me will say that, that I'm very much committed to working in partnership, understanding their needs and their challenges, and figuring out what government can do to help meet them.
Thank you. You know that I'm also the incoming new chair of the Labor, Health, and Human Services Subcommittee on Appropriations, which drafts annual legislation to fund the Department of Labor. One point of significant bipartisan cooperation within the Labor HHS bill has been support for increasing funding for apprenticeships. Over the last several years, we have seen funding increase from $90 million in the year 2016 to $285 million in last year's omnibus. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about how that funding has been used at the Department of Labor and how it might help employers in especially smaller communities like we have so many of in Wisconsin, to how it would help employers find workers with the skills that they need.
I so appreciate the chance to talk about this. Thank you, Senator. So we are very proud of the work we've done in apprenticeship programs. We've done it in multiple industries in terms of expanding. So cybersecurity is one of those in-demand industries with high-paying jobs where there's a need for skilled workers. In just a 6-month period, we were able to expand apprenticeship programs in cybersecurity to the tune of 16,000 individual apprentices, bringing the total across the country to 43,000. Teacher apprenticeships. When we came in 2021, there were 2 states that had teacher apprenticeships. Now there are 17. In terms of your question about smaller communities. Actually, in Wisconsin, we have a grant. It's our Women Apprenticeships in Non-Traditional Occupations grant. It's a way of looking at, all these good jobs that we're creating should be available to all communities. And I have seen that when you give women a chance to do work that they did not imagine doing, they can change their own lives, they can change their families' lives. And we do have a grant just like that with the Wisconsin Regional Training Partnership, which is going to help at least 950 people in a small community to join apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeship programs.
Senator Tuberville.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Sue, thanks for being here today. Now, you have a long history of activism on behalf of organized labor. I think that's all understood, but very few examples of impartiality. You've been biased. For instance, you wrote in 2005 that businesses perpetuate economic injustice and use, abuse, and exploit poor people. I have some legitimate concerns that you won't be fair and neutral if confirmed. I'm not confident that your ability to act as a neutral and fair secretary won't be compromised by personal view. So, Ms. Sue, your nomination is opposed by at least 32 business groups and coalitions, and the primary concern we're hearing is that your confirmation would be devastating to a wide number of industries and businesses. I'm not an expert in labor law, but I have to say this much opposition concerns me. You have tried to assure critics that you would wear a different hat and be less of an activist, but I find that very hard to believe with all this opposition. Can you explain that and how you're going to overcome that?
Thank you very much, Senator. I'm not sure if I should still call you Coach. I know you said
Sure you
that I
can.
could.
I've been called worse.
In our meeting, but thank you for that. I also want you to know that I did tell my daughter that you said that she could come see you
Excellent.
to talk about the intersection between athletics and education, both of great interest to her. So I appreciate that question. I do believe that employers and employer associations that have worked with me could help to round out the perception of those who have not yet had a chance to work with me. I also have shared, and will say again, my own personal background has given me a front row seat to the needs, the issues, the struggles, the challenges, the difficulties, and the incredible work of small business owners who are the lifeblood and the job creators in all of our communities. My family now, my cousins, my aunts have businesses in California. So I have not only the personal perspective about how important it is, I think my record really demonstrates, especially in my work since I've been in government, how to build big tables, bring employers and employees together, labor and unions together. We've been doing so much of that just to build training partnerships, understanding that if you build a training partnership where participants know at the beginning of training that they're going to end up with a good job at the end of it, that's a very simple way to design a program that is going to work and is going to let you recruit people to it and have people want to stay in the program.
So following up on Senator Romney's question, have you made an effort to meet with non-union businesses and groups in your last 2 years?
Absolutely, Senator, yes.
How has that gone?
I think it's gone well. I mean, I think, again, employers are both excited about the opportunities created in this administration, right? We've seen that it's not just the historic federal investments that are going to bringing manufacturing back to the United States and all of the infrastructure investments. It's not just federal investments. There have been hundreds of billions of dollars in private investments, what's been called crowding in to meet the moment, to take advantage of what the federal government is doing. That is the president's vision for how we reimagine industrial policy and create an economy that works for everybody.
Let me get my last question here real quick. You've consistently worked to oppose and block efforts to stop illegal immigration. You reportedly sent a memo to staff during your time as California Labor Commissioner instructing them to turn away any immigration and customs enforcement agents who show up at labor offices without a federal warrant. I'm concerned about the fact that our southern border is wide open. I think we all are, most of us, and the negative impacts that this is having on our country. Could you provide that memo to us, to this committee?
Thank you very much, Senator.
Remember that memo? Do you remember it?
I don't remember it. I don't remember it well. I don't have access to it at this time. I do want to say, Senator, again, I think that my background is really about a commitment to the dignity of work and of the importance of making sure that workers have the protections that they need when they go to work so that they get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and that every worker who walks into the workplace comes home healthy and safe at the end of the day. I think that regardless of where you live in the United States, that is part of the basic promise of this country, and we want all workers to be able to put food on their table at the end of the day and put a roof over their heads, and that is the record of work that I have done in my career.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you. Ms. Sue, thank you for coming and spending some time with me talking about issues that are important to Connecticut. I may get to one of those if I have time. But first, I really wanted to give you an opportunity to expand a little bit on the answers that you were giving to Senator Romney. California is a really big state, and so every number coming out of California is going to be a big number. And so when you look at this question of unemployment insurance fraud, right, $100 billion is a lot of money. But I was looking at the percentages from other states when it came to insurance fraud. And there are some big numbers too. The number in California is about 11% of benefits paid, but In Tennessee, it was 15%. In Alabama, it was 14%. In South Carolina, it was 14%. In Kansas, it was 27%. Every state had issues here. But what seems important to me is that you led when it came to implementing reforms, so much so that, as I understand it, the Trump administration ended up adopting some of the reforms that you put in place. So I didn't sound like you got the chance to fully give the committee the information on the reforms that eventually became standard practice or recommended to other states, and just wanted to let you finish out that answer.
Senator, thank you so much, and thank you for meeting with me prior to this hearing as well. First, let me just state again very clearly that there is no place for fraud, waste, or abuse in systems like this. The criminal enterprises that took advantage of the lack of eligibility requirements built into the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program made it was not only bad because it was a fraud on taxpayers, it was also bad because it made it even more difficult for states to actually pay out claims to those who were eligible. So it was really a horrible situation that there was so much fraud on the system. But you are absolutely right, Senator, that once we saw that it was happening, and it happened because the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, and the state auditor said this too, it did not have safeguards in place at the get-go. It was meant to go out quickly because we were facing a massive crisis in which people were out of work through no fault of their own in unprecedented numbers. So it allowed people to self-attest that they were eligible. It had a minimum payment amount. A minimum payment should be paid. It had automatic backdating in it. So if you applied in August, but you were unemployed as of February, you got all of that, the amount back to February. Those were built into the program that states worked mightily to stand up very quickly on outdated technology and the rest, which is well known. Once, as California Labor Secretary, one of the things that I did was I stopped the automatic backdating. And that is believed to have stopped over $60 billion worth of fraudulent payments that could have gone out. After I did that, the Department of Labor, under the prior administration, did issue a directive to all states to do the same thing. Since I've been Deputy Secretary, what we've been doing at the Department of Labor is really trying to learn from those lessons, to make sure they are never repeated again, to work in collaboration with states, to be clear about the things that we should do on a national level to fight that kind of fraud, because that kind of fraud went from state to state, but also to shore up the unemployment insurance safety net so that in the next crisis, it can really deliver.
Thank you for that response. I wanted to make sure we got as much of that on the record as possible. I'm going to ask you a second question and just ask a commitment from you to work with me because I'm running out of time. You and I talked at length in my office about the challenge we have with the defense industrial base in Connecticut. We have to hire 5,700 new workers in Connecticut and Rhode Island at Electric Boat to meet the demands of the submarine fleet. We're producing more submarines than ever before. That's a real challenge for us, and it's a challenge we can't meet without assistance from the Department of Labor for apprenticeship programs and workforce training programs. So I just want to ask for your commitment to work with me and other members of this committee who are going to need DOL's help and need the Secretary's help directly in making sure that we have enough resources to train all the people we're going to need in order to fill the needs of our defense manufacturing base in Connecticut and throughout the country.
100%, Senator. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Mullen.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. It was a pleasure meeting you. I do have to kind of address something beginning. Our chairman came out with a very strong comment, daring everybody basically that they disagreed with your qualifications to say it with a straight face. And as always, he always talks about starvation wages, in which I thought, man, he's really setting the tone here. But then I'm just starting to figure out that's just your personality. No offense there, but this is your personality. But then I still understand, I don't understand the lack of knowledge, of basic knowledge, when this is the health, education, labor, and pension, the basic knowledge of understanding what labor cost really is. As a business owner who's employed truly hundreds of people, labor is always going to have a beginning wage. And everything else goes from there. So you can't call a beginning wage a starvation wage if there's always going to be a beginning wage. I don't care what industry you're in, it's always going to start something. The product that industry is making is going to adjust whatever the cost of that final product is. It's going to be delivered to everybody. But that is actually what an apprenticeship program is too, because that's supposed to get people into the program to start working towards that. But yet apprenticeship programs themselves can actually be kind of restrictive, because a lot of people that are entering these workforces that are going to maybe start requiring apprentices, they didn't want to go to college. But yet we keep expanding apprenticeship programs from 1 year to 2 year to 3 year to some apprenticeship programs are 4 years and longer. And individuals like, look, I didn't want to go to college. That's why I entered this workforce to begin with. So we got to think about what we're talking about when we start expanding apprenticeship programs. But it also understands the lack of people that's running these programs, running the industry, of actually understanding what business is like, which is why so many of us, why you are seems like a super nice individual, and we had a great conversation. That doesn't mean being nice qualifies you to be Secretary of Labor, because if you don't have that basic understanding of knowing what it's like, then how can you relate and truly represent both sides? For instance, have you ever been an employer of a business? It's yes or no. I'm sorry.
I have not, Senator, but
Okay.
my parents have,
No,
and my family is.
Have you ever done it?
I have not.
Then you don't understand what it's like, how hard it is to actually sit awake at night trying to figure out how you're going to man a job when you don't have the people there and you know you're going to have to do it. Have you ever created or balanced a budget for a business? It's yes or no. These are yes or no's real quick. I want to run through them as quick as I can. I'm going to take that as a no. Have you ever acquired or sold a business?
I have not, Senator.
Okay. Have you ever had to raise capital in order to launch a new business?
I have not, Senator.
Which goes back to one of your comments that you wrote about that I'll get to later. Have you ever had to provide quarterly reports to shareholders?
Senator, I have not
Okay.
done these things.
All right, and I'm just going, this is qualifications, because the chairman said, can you actually say with a straight face if you're qualified on this? And these are points we're trying to make. Have you ever decided which health insurance plan you're going to offer to employees?
Senator, if I may,
I'm
if
just going through these because I'm making a point. The chairman's the one that threw down the gauntlet and said, I dare anybody to say this without a straight face. I'm just trying to make a point here. So have you ever?
I have not chosen
Okay.
a health insurance plan for an employee.
Have you ever had an employee file workers' comp that you had to either work with or fight against?
As an employer, no.
Do you know what a workers' comp experience mod is?
I do based on my work
But
in
you never
government.
had to actually apply it to your bottom line to figure out what your profit margins and bottom line is going to be. Have you ever filed taxes on behalf of business?
I have not, Senator.
Have you ever had to comply with federal regulations on a small business?
No.
So it's really hard to understand what it's like when you're getting mandated and regulations coming at you. Have you ever had your business model threatened by the federal government's overreach of regulations?
No, Senator.
I have, and that's what drove me here today. And when you have someone like yourself that makes a comment like this, like you did in 2005, says the very definition of a corporation as an entity that is created to permit maximum income and designed to insulate individuals who profit from the liability. That's your opinion about a corporation. Do you still stand by that?
So I don't remember when I wrote that or
This
the
is- you
context
wrote it.
in which I wrote it. I don't.
It doesn't. There is no context to which this can be taken out of context. Do you still believe that corporations are just the insulation to shield individuals like myself? Because we don't have any liabilities, and we have no financial liabilities at all as a corporation, as an owner at all. I mean, I don't understand that. But do you still stand by that comment? Yes or no?
I will tell you what I do stand by, Senator.
No. I just need yes or no because I'm about ready to run out of time, and I got one more question. Do you stand by that comment?
I do stand by the important role that both employers and
Do
employees
you believe
play in
that
our
American
economy.
society was built on white privilege and systemic racial subordination, to which you've written also?
Can I say what I do stand by, Senator?
No,
I do-
those are your comments. I'm asking you, do you still believe on both those comments? You wrote those in your comments. Do you stand by those comments or do you not? You wrote them. Do you stand by them or not?
I believe that we,
No, ma'am. I'm just
Can't-
saying, do you believe what you said? It's a yes or no.
I will say this,
If you
Senator,
can't
I think it's
answer
a
heck
longer
no on this-
conversation.
If you can't answer a heck no on this, Ms. Sue, then that's a huge problem. Because just like our chairman sometimes leads with the gavel with a biased opinion towards labor, you also will lead the secretary, as Secretary of Labor or Labor Department with bias. Because you cannot say those type of statements like that and represent all sides. With that, I yield back.
Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Secretary Sue, thank you for meeting with me earlier and talking about issues that I'm concerned with in Virginia, the tight labor market, seasonal visas for a lot of our seafood workers. I really appreciate it. I look forward to supporting you and working with you on those issues. I just want to summarize some topics, and I want you to tell me if I'm wrong at all in summarizing what I've heard before. Business interaction, Senator Romney said that you had only started to meet with business associations recently, but during your 2 years, you've met with businesses repeatedly, correct?
Yes, Senator.
Chambers of Commerce, United Airlines, businesses connected with ports all around the country, railroad industry. So you've had dialogue with businesses constantly during your 2 years. Isn't that accurate?
That is correct.
And
Thank you,
business
Senator.
groups like the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce have said about you, Secretary Sue, quote, has worked with the chamber numerous times to bring a reasonable, balanced voice to labor issues. That's one of the biggest chambers of commerce in the United States. Isn't that correct?
I don't know for a fact, but yes, I do believe that is what they said. Thank you.
And the Society for Human Resources Management, which manages it's HR professionals, businesses around the country, they support your nomination. So I think in business interaction, it seems like you have been engaging in the dialogue with businesses. To Senator Mullen's point, you haven't run a business. We have cabinet members who have. I think cabinet members should bring diverse experiences to the table. You bring a set of experiences. You can't have all experiences, but other members of the cabinet, Gina Raimondo, Secretary of Commerce, had a very active role in the private sector before her public service career. With respect to the concern about independent contractors, folks are concerned with this particular California AB 5 law. It began with a California Supreme Court decision. You've never been on the California Supreme Court. It was codified by the California legislature. You were not a member of the California legislature. You were obligated to implement state laws just as you would be obligated to implement federal laws in your capacity as Deputy Secretary of Labor. You have issued a regulation in this space that does not incorporate the ABC test for determining who is an employee and who's an independent contractor. Major groups that were concerned with AB 5, like Lyft and the Franchise Association, have praised the federal standard that you've issued as, thank goodness this standard does not include the thing we didn't like about the California standard. So there's a PR campaign, don't California, Arizona, or don't let Julie Sue California our workplace. Very explicitly, the independent contractor rule that Department of Labor is issuing now is not the AB 5 rule, so the attacks on the AB 5 rule really are not relevant to what the Department of Labor is doing today. On the unemployment insurance issue, I agree with Senator Romney and others. Fraud's outrageous, and especially people taking advantage and defrauding a program that was designed to help the nation out of a crisis. But many states, as Senator Murphy said, had fraud rates much higher. And for people who just didn't focus on this, let's be really clear about what this fraud was. I'm going to give you some statistics. The week that ended March 14, 2020, which was the last pre-pandemic week, 278,000 Americans filed unemployment insurance claims. The next week, it was 2.9 million Americans. The week after that, it was 5.9 million Americans. The week after that, it was 6.1 million Americans. So our nation's employment agencies that have been used to dealing with 278,000 claims a week nationally, we're now dealing with 20 times that. And what did Congress do? We did three things that added to your workload even beyond that explosion of claims. We first said you have to give benefits for more weeks. We second said you have to increase the amount of benefits to get us through this economic catastrophe. But the third thing, and this is where all the fraud was, in every state, including Virginia, we made you pay unemployment benefits to a whole class of people who are not part of the unemployment system. Independent contractors, gig workers. Congress required you to do that. People who weren't in the California system, who weren't in the Virginia system, and we did it to save the economy. 95% of the fraud in California was in that program, and that 95% number was probably the same in virtually every state. It was Congress that required you at a time when your workforce was low because unemployment claims were low. But now unemployment claims were expanding 20-fold. Just in your normal business, we made you do 3 things, including one thing that was adding people who hadn't been in the system at all. And some scammers took advantage of it. It infuriates me when scammers take advantage of seniors or when scammers take advantage of something like that. But you were dealing with a reality that you can't blame Congress for this, but I can be honest about how this problem got created. And I'm upset with the fraud, but I'm not upset that Congress did what it did because it helped this nation get through the worst public health emergency and one of the most serious economic challenges in the last 100 years. I think you did a fine job under challenging circumstances trying to negotiate through this extraordinary set of programs, and I think you've done a fine job in your 2 years as Deputy Secretary, and I look forward to supporting your nomination.
Senator Budd.
Thank you, Chairman. And Deputy Secretary, thank you for being here today. You're on record supporting AB 257, and this bill creates a fast food council of 10 unelected government bureaucrats to dictate wages and working conditions for California restaurant businesses. And this bill forced unionization on workers who never even asked for it. And it took independence away from small business owners, and it gave it to unelected bureaucrats. Deputy Secretary Sue, California voters have gathered enough signatures to prevent AB 257 from taking effect. So will you push policies as the Secretary of Labor, like you did in California, that take away the independence of job creators?
Thank you very much, Senator. It's nice to see you here today. I believe that bona fide independent contractors will always have a place in our economy. They have and they will, and they're very, very important. I'm not positive if AB 257, I believe you're talking about a
Well, let me just go back
bill.
to the
Okay.
last part of the question, which is, will you push policies as Secretary of Labor, like you did in California, that take away the independence of job creators? That's more of a yes or no, with minor explanations.
No, and to be clear, I would absolutely respect the authority of
you.
this body, of you, to make laws that I, if confirmed, will be charged with enforcing.
Thank you. You've called the ABC test a model for the country. Yet voters in California decided that it shouldn't even be a model in that state, with nearly 60% of voters overturning the part of the law that applies to app-based ride-sharing and delivery services. AB 5 also resulted in a list of carve-outs for industries that was longer than the law itself. Aside from the fact that California lawmakers are obviously picking winners and losers, it seems obvious that a law requiring more than 100 separate carve-outs, it's deeply flawed. Deputy Secretary, do you believe that California's AB 5 is a model for the Department of Labor to build its federal labor policy on?
Thank you, Senator. I believe that AB 5 was a bill passed by the California legislature and given to me in my then role to enforce. I do not believe that the ABC test that is codified in AB 5 is federal law, and I do not believe that I could make it federal law unless you all made it federal law.
Let me push just a little more. So in your comments to Senator Cassidy, you said the Department of Labor does not have the authority to implement the ABC test, but do you still think it's a good model for the country?
I think,
few moments.
Senator, that bona fide independent contractors have a place in our economy and need to be able to operate. I also believe that misclassification, meaning when you have someone who should be an employee but is called an independent contractor, maybe they work side by side with other people who are doing the exact same thing as they are, but they're called an independent contractor, so they're not protected by minimum wage, overtime, unemployment insurance, and other laws, and the employees are, that is a problem in our economy that needs to be addressed.
So thank you. I want to shift gears to rulemaking. The fiduciary rule is still on the regulatory agenda this year, despite the fact that the last time this rule was issued, it had devastating effects, causing 10.2 million low and middle income individuals to lose access to investment assistance. I have serious concerns with the DOL re-implementing a failed standard, not to mention the potential mismatch of industry standards that might arise between it and the SEC's Reg Best interests. So I'm curious how much taxpayer money the DOL and the DOJ previously spent on implementation and litigation of the disastrous 2016 fiduciary rule, and how much both departments would project to spend should the Labor Department move forward with another rule. Any idea how much you would spend on that, on implementation and litigation?
So, Senator, thank you. I don't know the answer. I was not here in 2016. I will say that your point is precisely why it's so important for us to engage with all stakeholders before adopting any rule.
Hopefully that includes 10.2 million low and middle income individuals who have lost access to investment assistance. So I'm out of time. I'm going to be opposing your nomination. I do appreciate your time today, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Cassidy for the hearing, and Acting Secretary Sue, it is good to see you. Thank you for meeting with me. Before I start with questions, I want to take a moment to echo some of my colleagues' comments this morning and reiterate how important it is to crack down on the alarming increase in child labor violations, expand access to career training pathways that will lead to good-paying jobs, and support workers who experience disabilities. So I want to start with a question about workforce training. People need access to high-quality workforce training that leads to good-paying jobs. As you may know, I, along with Senators Young, Collins, and Kane, are authors of the bipartisan Gateway to Careers Act, which would establish a career pathway grant program for community colleges, technical colleges, and workforce development partners to provide job training for unemployed or underemployed individuals. The bill would also provide support to workers who face barriers such as transportation and access to childcare. If confirmed, how will you increase access to workforce training and supports that boost program completion?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator, and for your work and leadership in this space. I really enjoyed our conversation about this and other issues. As Deputy Secretary alongside Secretary Walsh and as Acting Secretary, and if confirmed as Labor Secretary, this would really be a top priority for the Department of Labor. We are seeing the need for skilled workers in a whole bunch of different industries. That's why the Department of Labor recently put out an $80 million grant to expand nursing, training for nursing. I know this is something that this committee has already brought to light as well. And in that stakeholder engagement and listening to what the needs are in industries, we found that the need is not only for nurses themselves, but also for clinical instructors. And so the funding opportunity does address both those issues. We've expanded apprenticeships in trucking. That's one I haven't talked about yet. And I know a point was made earlier that it takes too long for apprentices to finish programs. I do think that we have to look at ways to recruit and to train and to get people in high quality, with high quality training into good jobs as quickly as we can. And if confirmed, I would love to work with you on this, Senator.
Well, thank you. I want to turn to a slightly different topic. In January 2023, the labor force participation rate for people experiencing disabilities was around 25%, compared to about 65% of those without a disability. We have to do better as a country at removing barriers and creating opportunities for individuals experiencing a disability so that they can enter and remain in the workforce. I deeply value the work that the Department's Office of Disability Employment Policy is doing to increase employment opportunities for these individuals and help employers better understand ways to support them. To this end, Acting Secretary Sue, can you detail some of the major initiatives currently underway by the Office of Disability Employment Policy?
Yes, thank you so much for that question, Senator. I was going to say, and you beat me to it, that the Department of Labor does have our own sub-agency that's devoted to exactly the issue that you're raising, because we see and understand that it is critically important, if we are to build an economy where no one is left behind, to make sure that communities that are not participating in the labor force to the extent that they want to and could have an opportunity. And that is the primary focus of our Office of Disability Employment Policy, or ODEP. And one of the biggest priorities for ODEP is, I think, what you're alluded to, which is competitive integrated employment, making sure that people with disabilities are able to work in the labor force alongside workers without disabilities, and get the training and the pathways for upward mobility that that they need and deserve. And so we've been doing that competitive integrated employment work in multiple areas. We do it through technical assistance grants. We do it through collaboration with states to make sure that funding that states are providing are all driving toward a holistic set of policies that will actually make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities on the ground. And we have done it in the form of technical assistance and work directly with employers so that they understand how to integrate these kinds of policies in the workplace.
Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to working with you on that. I have another question that I will submit for the record on apprenticeships, because I understand, one, I'm out of time, and I understand other people have touched on it, but it's an area in which New Hampshire leads, and we would very much appreciate working with the department moving forward and with people on both sides of the aisle to improve apprenticeships and make them more available in this country. Thank you.
Senator Brunn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Sanders likes to keep things on time here. I like that too. I'm from the logistics of business. Enjoyed our conversation yesterday. I'm going to read a statement here because, like I told you, I think so much of what you expect in the future, you got to pay attention to what might have happened in the past. So, Nera Tandon, in her capacity of president of the Center for American Progress, held a panel on wages and benefits in December of 14 with you, Wage and Hour Administrator David Weil, who recently did not get nominated into a spot, and Labor Secretary Tom Perez. On this panel, and I'm quoting what you said, just this last term, the governor of California signed a bill that creates a concept of client-employer that gets to the whole fissured workplace that David Weil has talked so much about. Fissured workplace is the definition of franchisor-franchisee. About the idea here that a century of labor laws are premised on employer-employee relationship. So when you have these middlemen and subcontracting, you really start to take away from that, from the protections between those at the top who contract for labor and those at the bottom. So the client-employer concept is, if you hire workers through a labor contractor as part of your regular course of business, and there is a whole definition for what regular course of business means, but then you as the client employer are responsible for all the wage liabilities as if you were the employer. And I think this has the potential to be a very important tool to get at the insulation between the top and bottom layers, meaning franchisors and franchisees. I'm not going to ask you to respond to it because I'm reading your statement. I will say this: a franchisor, franchisee is the most normal way you enter into the world of owning a small business. And I don't think this indicates that you would be working towards keeping that kind of structure there. And we also talked about gig economy, which we had a different conversation on. And I think there you were acknowledging that that was different maybe from a franchisor or franchisee. Here is where I'm gonna want you to respond to this. I think a lot of what has to do with anybody coming to a position of responsibility, you've got to probably justifies some of the things in the past. I want to read this. I think character is important, and I want you to respond to it. In 1989, you took part in the seizure of the president of Stanford University's office in a protest known as the Takeover 89. And I've got from the archives of Stanford Library, which I'd like to submit into the record, Chairman. Thank you. Stanford's president described the 10-hour occupation of his office as unlawful and as one of the gravest student protests in the last 16 years. 3 years after the Takeover 89 at Stanford, you were a key participant of the Griswold Nine, a group of radicals that seized and occupied a Harvard dean's office. In 1995, you told the LA Times, I guess, well, I was arrested, but you know well, in the end, all the charges were dropped. Please comment on that. That's on your record. It's in the archives of the Stanford Library. How can that possibly be something that would make us feel confident about you filling this spot?
Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you for the time that you spent with me. I know we had a lively discussion, and I appreciate your questions, and I'm going to try to address them. If I may just say, Senator, one of the first cases I ever had was a case involving garment workers who'd been trafficked into the country and forced to work behind barbed wire and under armed guard for as long as 18 hours a day. What we discovered in that case was it was not just their captors who had a role in that. There were contractors up the chain who knew about what was happening.
You wouldn't generalize that into an example that would be descriptive of franchisors and franchisees.
In fact, franchisors and franchisees had nothing to do with it whatsoever.
But that was my question earlier on.
Nothing to do with it whatsoever. For me, when everybody talks about how having a franchise company is a way that especially immigrants get into, own up their first business and get a toehold into the middle class. That is my family. That is what that was my experience.
Before you get gavelled out, do you want to comment on what happened at Stanford
yes.
and Harvard?
Just one more thing. The client-employer is a concept of state law, not a federal law, and I will assure this committee that my fidelity to federal law is complete. Okay, so we're talking about what happened in 1989. So, okay, Senator, let me just say this. I don't know if this is responsive, and I know you can stop me if it's not. I have an anecdote to share with you about this, which is, and my memory may be fuzzy about this, but at my Harvard graduation, the dean of the law school, Dean Robert Clark, who was the dean during the sit-in, actually said at the graduation ceremony that it was good to see Julie Su sitting in my office talking about how to address the issues that she sat in about in her first year rather than sitting in again. I share that with you because I do think there are many ways to make change. There are many ways to make the world a better place. And I have been somebody who sits down at the table and is willing to talk to anyone who,
The past
and find
is
common
generally
ground.
predictive of the future. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Acting Secretary Su, I agree with you. There are many ways to make the world a better place. And I have to say, looking at all of the work that you've done, I can see that you've devoted your entire life to making the world a better place. So I strongly support your nomination. You've done an outstanding job as Deputy Secretary at the Department of Labor, working as a key partner with Secretary Walsh. You have a well-deserved reputation for inclusive leadership, working with workers and business and industry associations alike to fulfill the mission of the Department of Labor and to implement the laws that Congress has passed. That would be your job as the Secretary of Labor. And let's just remind everybody that the mission of the Department of Labor is to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of wage earners, job seekers, and retirees in the United States, to improve working conditions, advance opportunities for profitable employment, and to assure work-related benefits and rights. And I think it's important to remember that that is the mission that you would swear to uphold if you, as I dearly hope, become our next Labor Secretary. I want to just note that there's been some questions raised today about whether or not you have any experience negotiating large labor contracts. And you probably aren't even aware of this because this just happened. But I understand that you played an important role in the contract negotiations between the International Longshore and Warehouse Union and the Pacific Maritime Association. And apparently this morning they have just reached a settlement and an agreement, which is a very important moment and something that I am sure you're delighted to know and to be aware of. And maybe you could just take a minute to talk a bit about your experience in this case, being a part of an important negotiation that impacts really the entire country.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Senator. Those are parties that I have known through my before I came to this role. They are in the midst of a very important negotiation that is extremely consequential, not only for the parties, but certainly for the parties, and also for our supply chain and our economy as a whole. I have been engaged with the parties, and our role is to help support them staying at the table, help support them resolving their issues. I did recently impress upon them the urgency of the issue, and I am pleased that they have made real progress that has been announced. There will still be a few issues that the parties need to resolve, but I think this is a good example of how the collective bargaining process really works. So thank you very much for noting that, Senator.
And I think it's also an example of how important it is for leaders like you to be integrally engaged in this. And I'm just going to offer for the committee, this is a quote from Gene Soroka, who's executive director of the Port of LA, and he said, this is just like brand new. He said, "Communication has been daily, hourly, by the minute. Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su has been on the phone with us morning, noon, and night." That is the kind of leadership that you have demonstrated, and it is why you are respected by folks in both labor and in business who have had an opportunity to work with you because they value effectiveness and they value somebody who is about seeking solutions to problems rather than making problems. And speaking of making problems, Mr. Chair, sometimes it happens that big business lobbyists decide collectively that they are going to flex their muscle and to try to defeat a highly qualified candidate. And often those attacks have very little connection to the actual person or their record. In fact, they are about politics and money. And I think that this is one of those situations where you have the big business lobby putting up billboards in the states, senators on this committee attacking a nominee. You know what is going on here. They are trying to use their money to influence this process. And it is our job, Mr. Chair, to cut through all of that and to get to the real person and their qualifications. And I think the record is clear that you are highly qualified to serve as Labor Secretary. And I am very grateful for the opportunity to support you, and I look forward to seeing you in that seat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Acting Secretary Su. Welcome back to the committee. First question for you is regarding a project that I had some time to spend with former Secretary of Labor, Marty Walsh. Secretary Walsh was very helpful in his capacity as the head of the Department of Labor in supporting the Willow project. This is a resource development project in my state that promises great opportunities for Alaskan workers at a time when our economy is struggling. He recognized the value of that, the value that this project could create over 2,500 construction jobs, 300 long-term jobs, and really contribute to our nation's energy security. So as I have looked back over your tenure there at the department, I see that you've held 22 meetings with the EPA or climate-related advocacy groups, not too many that I've noted with industry or employer groups. So the question for you this morning is whether you would continue Secretary Walsh's support for projects like the Willow projects that clearly create jobs, improve our energy security, regardless of what part of the energy sector that they're in. So it's one thing to say that you support renewable energy jobs, but in my state, we are still, the basis of our economy is still resource production, resources that this country relies on. So your support for projects like the Willow Project.
Thank you very much, Senator. It is good to see you again. I know that that specific project wasn't something we talked about last time, but many of the issues facing Alaska were, and I appreciated that chance to speak with you then. So Secretary Walsh and I worked very closely over the last 2 years. He treated me as a true partner, and when the president nominated me to become labor secretary, he said that he wanted me to help finish the job. So the idea of continuity, the idea of making sure that we deliver on the many big, important things that we're trying to do as we continue the robust economic recovery that we've had are things that I'm very, very committed to. And I stand by the decisions that were made during his tenure and obviously under the leadership of the president on the issue that you raised, the project that you're talking about.
Well, you haven't told me that you support the Willow Project and the fact that it will provide significant jobs, which again are very important to my state. But it's not just projects that have gone through that pipeline, so to speak. We have considerable opportunities when it comes to critical minerals, responsible mining projects that, again, will put in place significant economic opportunities and job opportunities while producing the raw materials. So I would hope that, again, there would be a recognition that even if you have to drill or dig, that these are jobs that this country needs, and that the Department of Labor and certainly the Secretary of Labor would support those. I want to ask about unemployment insurance. And when you first came before this committee, I expressed a concern at the time because in my state, we have a very aged or aging system when it comes to our UI system. And we provided funding here in Congress for the specific purpose of helping states modernize their aging systems. We clearly need it. It's estimated to cost us about $50 million. But the state of Alaska did not see any of this that Congress had allocated. It's my understanding that instead those funds were dispersed for DOL Tiger Team project. We don't know exactly what that is, but we do know that states like Alaska who are desperately in need of these modernization and updates didn't receive it. So the question to you is why? Why DOL did not use the funding that we provided to support the creation of new UI systems, and then whether or not you recognize that this has to be a priority for us.
So yes, Senator, thank you. To take the second question first, I absolutely recognize why it has to be a priority. As someone who was at the state level during the pandemic, I know we've had a conversation about the outdated technology and the need to really build the system so that it can be flexible and reliable enough when we have crises. I want to know, I don't know the answer about Alaska, but I will tell you that one of the things that I've been working on over the last 2 years is making sure that the $2 billion or so in American Rescue Plan money that was meant for states is going out to states. Some of it has happened in phases. So some states have, and I know in some of my meetings, we talked about how much has gone to a certain state for fraud prevention, for improving equity and access to unemployment insurance and the like. I will look into what has happened with Alaska. It may be that, and some of this was done in conjunction with where the states were in terms of their engagement with us, but our plan is to get the vast majority of that funding out to states in the way that they were intended by June.
Senator Hickenlooper.
And just because I don't, just to finish that, I think you were about to say you do support the Willow Project.
yes, I support decisions that have been made in this administration. And I think your point, Senator, was that there are other projects that are coming. And I absolutely commit to you to sit down with you, to understand the issues, to make sure that the people of Alaska and the important economy of Alaska is heard and well represented in the decisions made at the Department of Labor, if I'm confirmed.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator.
I've made no secret of my admiration and appreciation for Julie Sue, and I appreciate you being here again and going through this. As someone who I spent 8 years as the mayor of Denver, 8 years as the governor of Colorado, I spent a lot of my time trying to recruit and attract people to public service who in many cases could make enormously more money, have more prestige or celebrity status, although your celebrity status is pretty good here right now, I have to say. And I have to say, I can't think of anyone I ever was able to hire who brings to the table the skill set and the experiences that you bring to the table. And I think as a child of small business owners, your firsthand experience gives you an insight into what it's like to run a franchise, to be a small business person as a first-generation American. You understand what so many workers and families across this country are facing every day. And I think your focus on being transformative for so many people is unbelievably powerful. Lastly, as a mom, you recognize the need to invest in our next generation of workers by making sure that pipeline works. We have a 21st century pipeline that does work, and it's great that your daughter's here through thick and thin. And I have a son who's taking exams today myself out in a college in California. So anyway, I look forward to you getting confirmed. I wanted to talk just a little bit, and I know that apprenticeship has been covered thoroughly already, and I don't want to, you can't say beat a dead horse because it's too powerful and too important to refer to in such terms. But we talked previously about how apprenticeship maybe needs a rebranding and a refreshing, because a big impediment is convincing not just students but their parents that this is an experience that might be a good fit. And for every individual, it's going to be different, but we need to rebrand it so that it doesn't drag down the opportunities for so many people. You want to comment on that, this idea of a refresh?
I mean, I agree with that. Thank you so much, Senator, for all your comments and for our conversations and for your support. I agree that, and it's funny, I just had this conversation yesterday with a large employer association who said the exact same thing, that one of the challenges we face as we seek to expand the manufacturing sector in the United States and build good jobs to manufacture semiconductor chips and all kinds of things across this great nation, that we need to rebrand some of the jobs that have been for a long time. The jobs are new. There's ways to do them that are different, that also make them much more accessible to whole communities that might not have been included before. And so I think making it clear that a pathway to an apprenticeship for someone who is going to get a job that does not require a four-year degree is just as valid, is just as worthy of our respect and our praise as going to a four-year college, is something that I commit to you. I know it's something you care deeply about, that we should be engaged in that rebranding, that we should use the privilege of being in these seats and having our voices to make sure that that happens. And I think that will really help with the commitment to creating a very robust manufacturing industry in the United States.
Right, and I don't think we can emphasize it enough. I know the ranking member, I know the chair agree with us on this, that this is one of the looming opportunities that is there for the taking. It just takes will and great leadership at the top, which I think you could provide. I'm down to 25 seconds, but at some point, maybe for the record, you can look at, I know we talked a little bit about small business employers, and the paperwork makes it hard for them to go through the apprenticeship process, and just they're so busy. At some point, I hope that we can work together with the Department of Labor to facilitate that, so there's less, obviously I understand the security and the forms, but less red tape, less bureaucracy.
I absolutely commit to working with you on that, Senator.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Casey.
Acting Secretary Sue, great to be with you, and thanks for your public service. I'm going to support your nomination proudly, and you're not only prepared to do this job and well qualified, I think you'll serve with distinction as you have in the Department of Labor in your work already. I think it's important to put a few things on the record. It may prevent me from getting to my questions, but I'll start with the mission of the department. I think it's been lost here in the discussion in Washington. Sometimes Washington is, you have a debate that is grounded in facts, and sometimes there's a lot of hot air, and we've heard a lot of that of late. Here is the mission statement for the United States Department of Labor. It's the mission statement today. It was the mission statement under the prior administration. Here it is. Quote, to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of the wage earners, job seekers, and retirees of the United States, and also to improve working conditions, advance opportunities for profitable employment, and assure work-related benefits and rights, unquote. It's not the Department of Corporations. It's not the Department of Employers and Employees and all the talk you heard here today. It's the Department of Labor. I want a Department of Labor that is fighting every day for workers, not as some have characterized it. It's a department that has to administer some 180 federal laws for 150 million workers and 10 million workplaces. There's a lot of work to do to protect workers. If corporations were doing their job, we wouldn't need a Department of Labor, but you need one in the United States of America. A couple things about unemployment insurance. This is where the hot air is in Washington in this debate about this nomination. So I want to clarify a few things. The first being, California is a huge state. You paid out more claims than anybody. 1 in 5 of all unemployment claims in the country. Is that correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Isn't it true that 95 to 98% of the fraud in California was not from the regular unemployment program that you administered, but actually from the specially created Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program created by the United States Senate and the House in the middle of the pandemic? Isn't that true?
That's true, Senator.
So here's what we had. We had a special unemployment program set up for the pandemic, the worst crisis in 100 years. And a lot of things went well, and a lot of things didn't go very well. Here's what Bloomberg Law said. This isn't me. Bloomberg Law said this, quote, many of the fraudulent claims in California across the country have stemmed from a federal virus relief program. They didn't put in parentheses the CARES Act that 96 every United States senator voted yes on. This program launched in April to support independent contractors and other workers not previously eligible for benefits. Guidance from the Department of Labor last year directed states to begin paying benefits to claimants under this program who had yet to provide documentation verifying their past earnings. The ability of states to accept self-certifications allowed vulnerable workers to get faster payments, but also exposed the system, the state systems, to paying out false claims, unquote. That's Bloomberg Law talking about what the Congress did and that the states had to administer. So I think it's pretty clear that there's been a lot of hot air and a lot of fiction flying around Washington about what happened in California. I hope there's a similar examination of every state's unemployment insurance record as well. So here's my question in the minute that I have left. It's about a topic that you made reference to with Senator Hassan, subminimum wage. We're trying to do everything we can to phase it out, to get rid of it. It's not good for our workers, good for workers with disabilities. So we're trying to get rid of it, to be blunt about it. I want to phase it out and to make sure that people with disabilities have a fair shot in the workplace. Senator Daines and I have a bipartisan bill, the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act, that will lift up workers with disabilities and raise their wages. I want to ask you again, I know this is by way of reiteration, what is the administration doing to ensure that we have competitive integrated employment for people with disabilities, and specifically, how are you enforcing the 14C requirements?
Well, thank you very much for our meeting, Senator, and for this question, which is very important. So competitive integrated employment is the North Star. It is where we want to make sure that all workers with disabilities are able to access the same good jobs we keep talking about, get the training that they need to succeed in those jobs, the supports that they need in the workplace, and pathways to upward mobility in those jobs, just as workers without disabilities have. And at the Department of Labor, our sub-agency, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, is laser focused on that work. And I've been engaged with them over the last 2 years as Deputy Secretary on making sure that we are finding every possible way to expand such programs, to support employers who are adopting those programs, to provide technical assistance to employers to do outreach to workers with disabilities.
I know we've got to conclude. We'll work with you on this, and I just look forward to working with you on it. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I do too. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Marshall?
All right. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for being here. Ms. Sue, as has been alluded to here, that nationally we had a significant problem with the unemployment insurance benefits. But what I want to talk about is the statute of limitations. So we approached $200 billion of improperly paid unemployment insurance benefits, and many of those statutes of limitations on these cases will be expiring in 2025. We have legislation that would extend the statute of limitation on fraud for another 5 years that would be consistent for the statute of limitations for PPP and COVID EIDL fraud. How do you feel about extending the statute of limitations on those cases?
Thank you very much, Senator. I know I've said this already, but I feel like it bears repeating that the fraud, waste, and abuse in the system was unacceptable. It's intolerable. That's why I took the steps I took, and that's why at the Department of Labor, I have been so focused on making sure that we are creating an unemployment insurance system in conjunction with states that is going to stop fraud at the front door, deliver benefits to eligible individuals, be the safety net it's intended to be for workers who are out of a job through no fault of their own, and to be good stewards of taxpayer money. As I've also said a few times today, but not about this particular issue, so I appreciate your question, I have full deference to the authority of this body and of the decisions that Congress makes about the right policies in this case and in others. And if that is something that Congress were to pass and entrust the Department of Labor to enforce, then if confirmed as Labor
But
Secretary,
you agree there's a lot of
so.
money still out there, and these cases are still ongoing, and we could gain back some of those monies if we continued those investigations.
You know, Senator, that is a very good question. I don't know, I don't believe that there are new fraudulent payments going out every day in the same way that we've talked about. I mean, obviously, the pandemic unemployment assistance program
So I'm talking about
ended.
cases that are already should have been open that are not been closed yet. So extending the statute of limitations would allow us to keep going after the old ones.
Yeah, I will say, Senator, one thing is that at the Department of Labor, our Office of Inspector General has also been doing work to investigate cases, to try to recover monies where possible. And I do think that is an important part of the fight against fraud.
I want to turn and talk about the rules on joint employer definitions that have gone through significant changes in the past decade. Previous administration's rule provided a clear-cut, defined, and accurate definition of a joint employer. And again, you may have answered this question already. We're bouncing between committees. Under your leadership, this rule was rescinded and has not been replicated with anything. This has caused quite a bit of uncertainty for businesses. And to that end, would you agree that an employer should be considered a joint employer only if directly, actually, and immediately exercises significant control over the primary elements of employment?
Senator, thank you so much for that question. The joint employer rule that was put in place by the prior administration was actually vacated by a federal judge, meaning a federal judge said that that rule could not stand. As a result, the Department of Labor rescinded it. What that did was restore the state of the law to the place it was before that rule came into place, which was based on decades of federal cases interpreting who a joint employer is and under what circumstances it would apply.
Do you agree with what I defined a joint employer was a second ago? You want me to go through that again? Would you agree that an employer should be considered a joint employer only if it directly, actually, immediately exercises significant control over the primary elements of employment?
Thank you for that question, Senator. The joint employer test, I know you know this, is a fact-specific test. It's a test that's based on the relationship between, two or more
So
possible
I
employers.
defined it one way. Would you agree with the way I defined it? I think it's a yes or no question.
Senator, I'm not familiar enough with the case law to say that summary of it is an accurate statement of it. But I think to the point.
Then lastly, if
Okay.
you, and I understand that, business has been waiting over a year for an answer from the Department of Labor. Do you think that they deserve an answer sooner so they can make plans? There's nothing worse for a small business, for any business, than uncertainty.
I 100% agree with that. I think the regulatory certainty is very, very important. I know that from my family's history of having a small business, as well as my extended family's current status as business owners. The joint employer test, as it stands, is based on case law that has been developed over several decades. The Department of Labor does not have in its current agenda a plan to issue another rule about that.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Marshall. Senator Cassidy.
Yes, again, thank you, Ms. Sue. Again, a wonderful personal story, and you've handled yourself very well in a very stressful situation. I'd like to clear up a couple things that were said. Senator Smith suggested that there had been a final agreement achieved in the International Longshoremen's Strike. That is not the case. Just for the record, the Pacific Maritime Association stated last night, we reached tentative agreement, but we're still on things we've been negotiating, major issues yet to be discussed, much less reach agreement on, just for the record. Secondly, I have to disagree with my good friend Bob Casey. The Department of Labor should also be about employees and not just unions. And I'm sure you meant that, but it implied not. And there's a lot of gig workers, freelancers, who objected to AB 5 and would feel as if their interests were not adequately represented. And that's what a lot of this discussion has been about. And lastly, part of our discussion, I'm a doctor, you might guess I'm very suspicious of attorneys. But regarding the ABC test, that the prior administration's rule had been vacated by a district court, but was on appeal. So it's not for sure that it would have been continued to be vacated. And indeed, I'm told that it is consistent with Falk versus Brennan from the Supreme Court, if I got that correctly. And lastly, that the subsequent rule put out by this administration began to redefine roles much more consistent with an ABC test, as opposed to that which has been precedent. I say all that for the record, and again, Senator Casey, thank you for your indulgence.
If I could just say one thing, Senator, I will accept your suspicion of attorneys, but say I love doctors. And my mother, who's watching, would want me to say to you, as I said to you once, that a liver surgeon saved her life at one point. And so I thank you and your profession for all you've done, including for my mom.
Thank you.
Well, let me just also say for the record that the mission statement I read from was not about one kind of worker, union versus non-union. It was the mission of the department is to foster, promote, and develop the welfare of three groups: wage earners, job seekers, and retirees. And I think that should be kept in mind, and as opposed to a different name for having corporations as opposed to employees. But we can continue to debate that, I guess. But thanks very much. I'll read a statement for Chairman Sanders. This concludes our hearing. Thank you, Ms. Sue, for joining us today. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 68 letters from labor and advocacy organizations, businesses, and individuals in support of Ms. Sue's nomination. As a reminder, the committee will vote on Ms. Su's nomination next Wednesday at 10 a.m. in this hearing room. For any senators who wish to add additional questions, questions for the record will be due tomorrow, Friday, April 21st at 5 p.m.
And I was supposed to, I'm sorry, I forgot to do this. I ask unanimous consent to enter letters in opposition to Ms. Su's nomination representing 50 organizations and business groups expressing concerns.
Without objection. The committee stands adjourned.